Hey guys, so welcome to part 3 of the React tutorial series. In this video, I'm going to continue talking about React's core features and particularly what React have developed, what React give us, or the abilities that we get from writing our HTML inside of JavaScript files inside of JavaScript functions. And so in the last video, I talked about how we can create custom HTML tags, custom components, and reuse them, and also how we can include logic, JavaScript, any kind of JavaScript inside of our components and render that inside of our HTML directly. And so the last element, the last kind of main element, at least I'm going to go through now, is actually the ability to pass data between our React components. And so you can see here in our app component, obviously we're rendering our browser dimensions component twice. So that is, so obviously it was a bit of an arbitrary example that I gave. Something that might be a little bit more interesting or a bit more useful is whether we could have a component that shows us the width, browser width, and a component that shows us the browser height. And so obviously you could imagine that we might do two components. And copy and paste that. And that would be browser height, height, and then that would be browser height, right? And then that would be browser height. So that's a little bit more useful, a little bit more kind of a sensible thing that we might do. But this is still, this is a bit, still a bit, it's a bit long because we have to have this component, we have to have this as a separate component, and they're kind of pretty similar, right? Like they're both pretty much a div with a p in it, a browser, kind of tag, browser's x tag, and then the value, is coming from window. They're quite similar, right? And so this is kind of one of the big things about React is that actually, if we want to reuse our components, but there's one or two things that are different about the components. So for example, we want to reuse a component, but we want to change one or two things in it when we reuse it in a different time. We don't have to make a completely new component. So this example, actually, because these are so similar, ideally we would just want one component and somehow to say, okay, this is the width version, this is the height version. And so there is a way to do that, and it's through passing data into the components. And so let me put this into, let me put this back in browser dimensions. Let me get rid of this one. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to take that out, and I'm going to put a function parameter dimension. And so again, if you're familiar with JavaScript, and you know about function parameters, when you call a function, you can pass data in to the function, right? Through its parameters. And so the same thing, because components are just functions, you can do the same thing with components. And so basically, so actually what I want to do here is I want to make this browser. I'll probably make another, so I'll make another parameter. And so here, now, instead of having two components that are almost identical, but it's just like the two things that are different, which is the name here and the value here. Actually, I can just get those values from the function parameters, and then I can just have one component. And so how do I do that? So obviously these are not, we're not calling functions here the same way that we normally call functions. So how do we pass in our arguments, pass in our parameters? So you actually pass them in like a data attribute. So if you're familiar with HTML and you're familiar with attributes, for example, the obvious attribute that you can normally do in normal HTML is class names or IDs, right? These are called attributes. The things you put inside the tag before the sort of triangle bracket, before you kind of the tag finishes. Anything here, class, ID, there's a bunch of other ones as well. I think you can do style, you can like inline styles, right? Border, whatever, color. So these are called attributes. And you can, and if you want to pass data into a React component, like a function parameter, you can do the same thing. You write it as an attribute. And so the name of the attribute is the name of the function parameter. So the name of the attribute, so here when we were at class, the name of the attribute was class, and the value was equal to title, like a string called title. Here the name of the attribute is the name of the parameter, and the value then is the value that we want it to be. And so what we need to do here is we need to put back that const browser width equals window.inner width, and then to do the same for height. So we move the data up. We move the data into the app component, and we then pass it down. And so the thing that this saves us, so we have to write these things twice, obviously. So you still have to have these two lines, separate lines. But the thing that's saved is now we don't have to have two versions of this. Instead, we just pass the data down, and then type would equal what we want this thing to say, which would be width. And then we do the same for the height. Oops. Do the same for the height one. Sorry. So yeah. So one thing I forgot was to say that we need to put object brackets around these parameters, otherwise it doesn't work. So wrap your parameters with brackets. Then let's check this. So there we go. So now we have browser width, browser height, both individual separate things that we want to render, but we're using the same component. Same component. So the power of passing data down into the components like we do function parameters. And so that's kind of the last really powerful thing that we get from writing JavaScript. So with HTML, I mean, you can never do anything like this, right? Like this would be much more complicated to write this in JavaScript, in old school JavaScript and HTML. This becomes very, very easy, very what's called declarative, which is to say we just declare what we want. We just write the things that we want, and don't worry too much about how this works. Just it's more about writing in your return in your HTML what you want to show, rather than in the old school JavaScript where you would, you'd have to write all the steps. Like here, you have to write document get element ID dot inner text. So yeah, that's what React gives us. And so this pattern, these things here, they have a name. They're called props. And so anytime we want to pass data into a component, like this, through this kind of function parameter method, the name for this in React is called props. And so yeah, anytime we need to pass data, we want to reuse a component, but we want to change one or two elements, then we need to pass it props for everything that we want to change. Cool. So yeah, so that's a quick overview about props and about passing data, and that kind of wraps up just the overview of React core fundamentals and how we get the benefits we get from writing a HTML inside of JavaScript functions. So in the next video, I'm going to start to show some real examples, and put all of these concepts in real context and start to build up some understanding of how we actually start to write real things and how these all these concepts come together in actual kind of problem solving.